Welcome to EduRev.
Welcome students, I'm Claris Pereira Colasso and I have been training NEET medical aspirants in botany and zoology as well as NCERT based board exams for the past 8 years. In our previous video lectures, we have already studied a little bit about reproduction in organisms. We have completed asexual reproduction and we have studied a little bit about sexuality or sexual reproduction in organisms and the various events that could probably take place in a sexually reproducing organism. Today, we are going to study about the different phases that actually take place during sexual reproduction. Okay, so the events in sexual reproduction. Now, actually speaking, there are three events in sexual reproduction. The first being a pre-fertilization event, so an event taking place before the gametes fuse. The second, the fertilization event, which is the main event, okay, of the fusion of the two gametes. And finally, the post-fertilization event, so what takes place after fertilization. In today's class, we will be focusing on the first two events, that is pre-fertilization as well as fertilization. So to begin with the pre-fertilization events, actually speaking, there are two parts or rather two events in this particular category. The first is gametogenesis, that is the formation of gametes, and the second is gamete transfer. So after the gametes are formed, the gametes need to be transferred to a particular location. So starting first of all with gametogenesis. So as we have just said, gametogenesis would imply the formation of the two types of gametes, that is the male gamete and the female gamete. Now, one thing that we always need to be certain and very careful about is, irrespective of what is the parent, which we will understand a little later in the video, irrespective of whatever is the ploidy of the parent, a gamete is always inherently haploid. Okay, so you have the haploid number of chromosomes here always. Now, there are two categories of gametes, okay, and these categories of gametes are classified based on their morphological similarity. For example, you have something called as homogametes or isogametes, and on the other side you have something called as heterogametes. Now, what is the difference between the two, and how are we distinguishing them based on morphological similarity? Now, when we say homo means similar. The word iso comes from the word, maybe say you've studied isomers in chemistry, so iso also means similar. So homogametes or isogametes are those that are morphologically very, very similar to each other, to such an extent that you cannot even separate which one is female and which one is male. However, heterogametes, the word hetero tells you the word different, which means here there is no proper morphological similarity, so probably you are able to distinguish between the male and the female. Now, for us to understand better, let's take a couple of figures. Now, under homogametes, you can very clearly see the morphological similarity of the male and the female gamete in case of cladophora. So in cladophora, you can see you can't really make out what is the difference between the male and the female. Both of them look the same. However, if you look at heterogametes of human beings, now the egg cell is very clear. Okay, it's a very big cell and it's clearly different from the sperm. So if you look at the sperm, you have a flagellated cell here, sperm also called as the anthrozoid. Okay, so heterogametes imply morphologically different gametes, but homogametes imply morphologically similar gametes. So these are the two various categories of gametes. Next, we need to study a little bit about sexuality of organisms. Okay, for example, whenever we talk about the different kingdoms, so actually speaking there are 6 kingdoms, but for the moment we are just going to consider 5, that is your Monera, Protista, Fungi, Animae and Plantae. If you consider these 5, normally speaking, Monera and Protista, the first 2 kingdoms, most likely they show you a lot of asexual reproduction. Not to say that they don't have sexual, they do, but you will study asexual reproduction a little more predominant in them. However, when we talk about sexual reproduction, we are referring to the remaining 3 kingdoms, mainly speaking, that is Fungi, Plantae and Animae. So here we're going to study about sexuality. What are the terms of sexuality used in fungi and in lower plants, later on in higher plants, and then what we would use for animals. Now, the first is we consider a bisexual fungi or lower plant and a unisexual fungi or lower plant. Now, bisexual would definitely mean in one individual you have both sexes. That's why the word bisexual. So one individual carries both male as well as female reproductive organs. However, Unisexual would mean that in one individual we have either male or we have female, we do not have both. Okay, so here bisexual, the term used is homothallic or monoecious. Now let's try to understand what do these terms mean. The word homo means the same. Okay, now what does that really imply? If you take the entire species, if male and female reproductive part is going to be present in every single organism of that particular species, that means there is no distinction, characteristic distinction between the male and the female, which basically implies every individual is both male and female, which means every individual looks similar. Okay, so therefore the word homo. Also, since male and female are present in a single organism, okay, and since all organisms look similar, therefore there's no difference as such between them, which means there's only one type of individual in them. Therefore, the word monoecious. So, homothallic refers to the fact that all bodies are going to look the same simply because all of them have male as well as female. Monoecious refers to the fact that you have only one type of individual in that particular species. One type. Why? Because both male and female parts are present in that single organism. Now, in contrast to that, when we study unisexual organisms, we will use the word heterothallic. Now, what is the meaning of the word hetero? Heterothallic would tell you that I have a different male and a different female, which means in a species I've got different organisms. Okay. However, in that same species, I have got a different male and a different female, which means at least two types of organisms for one species, which therefore implies the word dioecious. Okay, so I hope you have understood the difference between homothallic monoecious and heterothallic dioecious. Moving on, coming to sexuality in case of higher plants. Now here, if you are bisexual, you're called monoecious, the same terminology. Now for your NEET exam, these two examples are absolutely important. That is coconut and cucurbits. However, unisexual organisms are going to be called, or unisexual plants are going to be called as dioecious. Example is date palm and papaya. So these examples are absolutely important for you. Now, suppose if we talk about unisexual flower, I'm quite sure you're aware that you have the presence of four whorls. Okay, so that is you have the presence of the sepals forming the calyx, you've got the petals forming the corolla, but we're not really considered about that because that's not sexuality. But the androecium and the gynoecium. The androecium is also called as the stamen, the gynoecium is also called as the carpel, and it contains the pistil. Okay, so suppose if a plant is said to be only with a male flower, then you will call that particular flower as a staminate flower, only the stamen present there. However, if a flower contains only the female part, you will call it as a pistillate flower, implying only the female portion present over there. So, staminate and pistillate flowers. Next, sexuality in case of animals. So, we're done with plants and we move on to animals. Now, this is pretty simple. A bisexual organism is called as monoecious, like normal, or is called as a hermaphrodite. Okay, now we're quite well versed with the term hermaphrodite. For example, earthworms are hermaphrodites. Okay, so sponges, tapeworms, leeches are other hermaphrodites. And unisexual animals are called as dioecious. Example is a human being. We've got a separate male and a separate female. Now, one characteristic that you need to notice over here is, generally speaking, it's not a rule, but generally speaking, as you move from lower organisms to higher organisms, you will observe that there is a tendency to move from bisexual into unisexual, implying that bisexual conditions are generally seen in case of lower animals and unisexual conditions are generally seen in case of higher animals. Now, what are the different methods of gametogenesis? So we want to form these gametes. What are the different methods to form these gametes? Now, gametogenesis can be formed by two methods. The first is meiosis and the second is mitosis. Okay. Now, in order to understand this method of gamete formation, let's try to understand what's the definition of meiosis and what's the definition of mitosis. Okay. Now, whether you would choose meiosis or whether you choose mitosis depends entirely on what is the ploidy of the parent undergoing gametogenesis. If you're haploid, it's different. If you're diploid, it's different. Okay. So let's look at these terms. What does meiosis imply? Meiosis implies that the ploidy of the daughters has to be half that of the parent. Okay, so if the parent is 2n, the daughters or the gametes forming from it should be n. However, mitosis on the other hand says the ploidy of the daughters has to be the same as that of the parent, implying if the parent is 2n, the daughter is 2n. Also, if the parent is n, that is haploid, the daughter should also be n. So these are the basic rules behind meiosis and mitosis. And that's what we're going to apply in this particular gametogenesis concept. Now, first of all, gametogenesis in a diploid parent. Now, if a diploid parent undergoes gametogenesis, it is always by meiosis. Now, always remember the end product, that is the gamete, has to be haploid. That's the rule that we have studied. Okay. Now, this is a concept of high organisms because most high organisms are diploid in nature. Okay. So if you can see here, there's a diploid parent cell, very specifically called as a meiocyte or a mother cell. Now, this technical term meiocyte is very important for the NEET exam. And you can see that this 2N cell undergoes reductional division, meiosis 1, to give you two daughter cells that are haploid each. However, meiosis is not complete yet. Okay. So meiosis 2, which implies separation of the sister chromatids, you have equational division here, and you will have the presence of four daughter cells, which are the gametes. So ultimately, what do we want to understand from this particular figure? From a diploid parent, through meiosis, we can result in four haploid daughter gametes. Okay, so that is important. Now, this is if the parent is diploid. However, if the parent is haploid, this is what we find in low organisms, for example, algae, or for that matter, even bryophytes and pteridophytes. In certain cases, you will see this. Okay, fungi, they are all haploid in nature. So, suppose if the parent is haploid, but I want to result in cells that are also haploid, daughter gametes should also be haploid. The only mechanism available to me is a form of equational division, that is none other than mitosis. So here you can see the haploid parent undergoing mitosis, which is equational division, giving rise to two haploid daughter gamete cells. So I hope you have understood the two types of gametogenesis depending upon what is the ploidy of the parent cell. Now, we have already studied the first type of pre-fertilization event, that is gametogenesis. Let's move on to gamete transfer. Now, gamete transfer is of different types, okay, depending on whether you're studying a lower plant or whether you're studying higher plants. We're going to focus mainly on plants over here. Now, if you remember, there are five categories or say divisions of your plant. So you have the presence of algae, bryophyta, pteridophyta, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So we're going to categorize them in two parts, okay. So let's study about algae, bryophytes, and pteridophytes. Now, in these three types of plants, lower plants specifically, you will find that their male gametes are motile, but their female gametes are normally stationary. Okay. Now, if a male gamete is motile, or at least one of the two gametes is motile, most likely you will require some sort of watery medium. Okay. So they are transferred. The gametes are transferred from one side to the other, from one parent to the other, with the help of water as a medium. But there's a problem over here. Since the male has to discharge the gamete, the male gamete is discharged into water, okay, and the female gamete can be present elsewhere. If you remember your 11th standard work, we have something called as a venter. So the egg is present in the venter, okay, in the female body. Okay, so what needs to happen is the sperm needs to move towards the egg cell. Now there is no 100% possibility that this particular sperm will reach. Some of them may reach, some of them may not reach. So therefore, can I say many sperm need to be produced so that at least some will find the egg cell? So numerous sperm are produced, and this is compensated because there's a lot of loss during transfer. Okay, now moving on to higher plants, so that is your gymnosperms and angiosperms. Now both these two plants have the presence of non-motile pollen in a way. Okay, so you have non-motile egg cells present in the ovule and you have non-motile pollen. So what must happen here? This pollen must be transferred with the help of pollinating agents. Okay, so pollination must occur from the anther to the stigma, either of the same flower causing self-pollination, or you can have cross-pollination. Okay, the moment the pollen falls onto the stigma, there is formation of pollen tube, and each pollen will give out about two male gametes, and these male gametes will go downward into the ovule and fuse with the egg cell. Okay, so this is how you have the production of a zygote within the ovule. That zygote will later on give rise to the seed. Now, let's move on to the next event. So we've studied pre-fertilization. We move on to the next event, that is fertilization or syngamy. Syngamy, the word syn implies synchronized gamete fusion. Now, what are the different methods of fertilization? Now, these different methods of fertilization basically come in because of the environment in which fertilization is occurring. For example, you can have something called as external fertilization, but you can also have something called as internal fertilization. Now, what is the difference between them? External fertilization occurs outside the female body, so the environment is outward. whereas internal fertilization occurs inside the female body, fertilization is inside. Now we need to understand why these differences take place and what is the advantage or the disadvantage of either of these. Okay, so let's take these distinction points, internal and external fertilization. Now, external fertilization requires great synchrony between sexes, but internal fertilization does not require as great a synchrony between sexes. For example, suppose, now we need to understand what's the meaning of this word synchrony. Okay, suppose if I give you frogs, so a male and a female frog, you need to remember that they undergo external fertilization, implying the male and female give out their gametes into water and then they fuse in water. So fertilization is an external event here, it's not in the female. Now the question here is, why great synchrony is required? Imagine if the male gave out its sperm at one time and the female gave out its egg cells at a whole other time. If there was no synchrony between the sexes, the probability of these two gametes meeting and fusing is very, very less. So therefore external fertilization requires a greater synchrony as compared to internal fertilization. Let's move on to the next one. Now, in case of external fertilization, large number of both gametes are required, whereas in internal fertilization, normally only the male is in large numbers. Now, let's take examples. For example, in case of the frog, the male and female gave out their gametes into water, so obviously both had to be in large numbers so that at least some of them would fuse. But in case of internal fertilization, let's take for example humans. The female gives out one egg cell, just one, normally speaking, per month. But the male, every time you have intercourse, the male releases millions of sperm into the female. So generally the number of sperm are always greater than the number of egg cells in internal fertilization. But in external, both have to be in great numbers. The third point. Now obviously if you take for example the frog, it required an aquatic external medium to transport the gametes so that the gametes had a place to fuse. So in external fertilization, a transport medium is a prerequisite. But in internal fertilization, it may or may not be required. Now let's take a couple of examples for internal fertilization where a medium is required and where it's probably not required. Now for example, if you take bryophytes, okay, in case of bryophyta, internal fertilization takes place, but the sperm is released into water and from there it must find itself into the venter, which is part of the female body, and it must enter this venter and fuse with the egg lying there. So here in this particular case in bryophyta, you require an aquatic medium to transport the sperm. However, if you consider humans, humans do not require an aquatic medium as such. However, they require something called as a copulatory organ, which is in case of humans the penis. So the penis helps to transfer sperm through the medium of semen, okay, into the female. So this is very different from what is happening in case of external fertilization. Moving on. Now external fertilization, obviously since fertilization is externally occurring, obviously the zygote will also be formed outside the female body. But in case of internal fertilization, since the fertilization process is within the female body, we have an option here. Either the zygote is formed within the body, for example in case of humans, the zygote is formed within and it grows within, continuous. However, if you consider in case of chicken, in case of hens, fertilization is internal. However, the zygote develops in an egg outside the female body, which means the female hen, the hen must actually lay the egg and this particular egg must hatch outside in order to release the zygote. If you know, the hen must incubate the egg, which means zygote development is occurring outside the female body. Okay. Finally, if external fertilization occurs and the zygote is always outside, definitely this particular zygote and this particular embryo, as it's developing into the adult, so during the whole process, it is vulnerable to its predator. However, in internal fertilization, there's an advantage over here. The mother's body houses the young one for at least some amount of time, so there is proper embryonic care and protection that will take place in case of internal fertilization. So students, I hope you have understood the two different events. They're in total three, but we finished the first two, that is pre-fertilization event and the fertilization event. Now if you have understood those two, let's go through some MCQ questions. The first, if the myocyte of an onion plant has 32 chromosomes, what would be the number of chromosomes in its female gamete? Now we have already discussed that the myocyte is the diploid mother cell that must undergo meiosis. So obviously speaking, if myocyte is 2n, that is 2n is equal to 32, obviously the gamete has to be half of that. So the answer here is 16. Okay. The second question. When a female and male differ in external morphology, it is called dash. So specifically, you're externally different. Okay, so you have heterogamy, homogamy, sexual dimorphism, and hermaphroditism. So what is the meaning of all of these? Now, very specifically here, if you go through heterogamy and homogamy, it implies fusion of dissimilar gametes or fusion of similar gametes. So cannot be either of these two because we're talking about the male and female external look. Okay. Hermaphroditism would imply that you are a bisexual animal, so a hermaphrodite. Okay, so coming to the word sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism means because of your sexuality, you are different in your external morphology, so sexually dimorphic. For example, in case of humans, separate male, separate female, based on the sexes. Okay, so the answer here is going to be C, sexual dimorphism. The next question. How many statements are incorrect with respect to asexual reproduction? Now let's go through these statements. It is a quick method of multiplication, definitely true. It does not introduce variability, also true. Adaptability and evolutionary significance are important in this method. Now this is a false statement because no variations, no adaptation, no evolution takes place in asexual reproduction. Next, a new individual develops from specialized or unspecialized parts of the parent. Okay, now this is actually a true statement because new individuals can develop from specialized parts or unspecialized parts. For example, when we speak about your micropropagation. Number 5, it produces comparatively fewer offsprings which are genetically similar. Now this is a wrong statement because asexual reproduction can give rise to multiple individuals. Okay, so option 3 and option 5 are wrong statements. So therefore your answer is option A here. Two statements are wrong. So students, I hope you have enjoyed today's class. You can access the other videos, tests, and a whole lot of other lectures through EduRev Infinity. And I'm sure by going through all of this, you will increase your nationwide ranking. Thank you, students.